Royal Exclusive is launching our first live show and you can be part of the audience. Join me at our HQ in the heart of London to put your questions to legendary Sun Royal photographer Arthur Edwards and former BBC Royal correspondent Jenny Bond. Head to the link in the description below for tickets.
Yes, I did meet Mr. Fayed on a number of occasions. Firstly, Diana would shop at Harrods. That was one of her favourite haunts before going down to San Lorenzo's in Beecham Place. And interesting enough, we always had a bit of fun with this because, we would go in door 10, which is the side of Harrods, and we'd say to each other, how long do you think it will be before Mohammed turns up with his entourage? I always say normally between 4 to 5 minutes. Diana said a bit longer than that. But I always won. It was always between 4 and 5 minutes. And suddenly you're going through door 10 and then walking around the food hall, you'd hear this and there's this wedge would appear by the cheese counter. And there in the middle of the security officers will be Mohammed, and then behind, bringing up the rear guard, will be his PA, Michael Cole. And then, of course, we had to make a sort of escape as soon as possible. But he wanted this contact with royalty because, let's not forget, 2 attempts of him failing to achieve or to get British citizenship. He had to find another way because that was, if you like, what he wanted in life. He had everything else in his life, but he didn't have this British citizenship. He didn't have a British passport. And he thought by ingratiating himself with members of the royal family would be a way of securing that. Thankfully, that didn't happen.
Well, that was before Dodi, wasn't it? That was attempts back.
Well, this was way before Dodi in the mid-80s. And of course, what he used to do, would send the green van up to Kensington Palace laden with goods from clothes through to food. And Diana was quite shrewd here in the sense that, look, I can't keep taking this van load of, unsolicited goods. And in the end, I had to tell the driver, look, it's got to end. And then, the last attempt when he'd send, I think his name was Henry, the doorman, would waddle his way up to Kensington Palace in his green livery coat and cap with smaller items. In the end, we managed to persuade him that you can no longer, sort of drop these things off. So, this was the beginning of it in the 80s with Fayed. And it was difficult for Diana. And the last thing I would say is this, that in the late 80s, Diana said to me, she said, I've got a great trip for you, Ken. I said, oh, what's that? She said, oh, well, you can go and recce a place for me in France. So I said, well, who's that? She said, well, Mr. Fayed's offered his villa in the south of France. And I said, well, ma'am, I said, you can't do this. And she said, why? And I explained at some length sort of why she couldn't do that, because at that time she was still married to the Prince of Wales. The Queen was obviously still alive. And to have accepted that at a time when, the British government, were not happy with Fayed at all. And so this would have been really bad a move on Diana's part. She listened and thankfully, said to me the following morning, OK, I see your point of view, we won't do it. But you see, even at that time in the 80s, Fayed himself was trying desperately to ingratiate himself with the royal family because he honestly believed that if he could win that side of his game, then he couldn't see any reason why he wouldn't be given British citizenship.
It was interesting you talk about that attempt there by al-Fayed to get Diana, because she did end up going to south of France, many years later. And I've been reading your book that you both put together, Diana, Closely Guarded Secrets, very good. But in there, you don't pull punches about al-Fayed and what happened in Paris. There's a quote here. My department had care of her, Diana, for some 15 years. Mohammed Fayed's team of bodyguard had charge of her security for 8 weeks, and then she died. I mean, he's not a man that all these horrendous things that have come out about him, he's not a man that you ever particularly liked or respected, particularly after the death of Diana. No,
I think the most important point here is that what's come out recently in the wake of these allegations about Fayed and his his pursuit of the staff, etc., was that the fear that he inherited in his staff and this controlling attitude. And for me, this is exactly what happened in Paris in 1997. Right. I mean, Fayed himself, was controlling this whole affair, this whole movement of Diana and his son Dodi from his office in Park Lane. Now, you can't control a protection operation when you're not in the country. And the point was that I have some sympathy here for people like Rhys Jones and Wingfield and others in the security team, because they were fearful of actually saying what they think should happen if that in any way sort of went against what Fayed wanted or even what Dodi wanted. So although I've been very critical of that operation in Paris with some justification, the reason why that happened, it wasn't because of, well, it was because of Rhys Jones and his security team, but they were so fearful of what Fayed would say if they for once recommended something that he disagreed with. And the one thing that they should have done, which they didn't do, was actually remove Henri Paul from the driving seat, because he was the cause of the accident. But they couldn't do that. Henri Paul had been a key member of the Fayed dynasty for 15, 16 years. He was much higher up that rung of authority than either Rhys Jones or Wingfield. And so for that reason, had they had taken him out of that driving seat, that accident would not have happened. But it was the fear and the control that Fayed, pervaded over these people, which he's done, sadly, with his employers over many, many years.
Rob, I mean, this isn't the first time that unsavoury characters try to ingratiate themselves with the royal family. I mean, Prince Andrew and Epstein, for instance. Did you have any run-ins with Fayed?
Not run-ins. I met him a few times. I mean, the reality is these claims are, if proven to be true, are absolutely horrendous, and there's obviously a lot of them, and the investigation was very thorough, but we'll have to wait and see what comes out. I mean, whenever I met him, actually, he was fairly personable, quite funny, and I think we have to be careful in terms of a lot of these allegations, because of course they're made about a man that's dead, and it never surfaced properly until after his death. That said, he wielded ran Harrods as if it was like Napoleon. He was in charge of the place, and there were a lot of people that were in fear of him and worried about their careers. So that's all involved. But yeah, I met him a few times. I met him when I was after Diana's tragic death. I was on the Daily Express, and if you remember at the time, the Daily Express were before I left, we kept writing stories long after I left about. Really were being fed by Fayed about the whole conspiracy theory. And I remember going along to his office in Harrods, and he presented me with all this evidence, which some of it was not evidence because there were affidavits that were unsigned, and it was a bit of a mess, actually. And I just thought, and I would point that out, so we can't possibly run this. But I mean, he used to give you a load of goodies. You were talking about the goodie bags he would give. He would present all these things, including ties, which were clip-on ties. He said, well, you can't wear a full tie because the security services will come behind you and try to strangle you. So he was very, very obsessed with all of that stuff, almost to the point of slightly paranoid about the security services and the establishment.
Well, he believed, he peddled that conspiracy theory, didn't he, that Diana's death was caused by the establishment of CIA and MI5.
Yeah, but he did all of that. We had to sit and listen to all this. I mean, this is one of the reasons I left the Express. We were going to write the book together. I looked at it, and he was giving evidence about the guy who made the ring, saying that it was an engagement ring for Diana, and it wasn't signed. And all these things, he had affidavits and evidence of the bloods on Henri Paul, which proved he wasn't drunk. But it did, he was, and so there was an awful lot going on. But the one thing I would think is that at that time, he was grieving for his own son, and also think he must have had some advice that, given that Diana was being driven by one of his employees in a car that he owned, that he may well have been culpable in many ways for her death, and was trying his best to avoid that being thrown at him. But he was a man in grief as well because he lost his son, so you have to bear that in mind.